The following instructional video is for students who want tips for writing their thesis. In accordance with academic writing, this video will tell you the rules of the APA 6th edition and the requirements of professors. What we explain here are some general rules for writing a thesis. Professors can have their own style and preferences. With this video comes an appendix, which gives you examples of each of the parts discussed in this video. The subject of your thesis. In research, we distinguish between dependent and independent variables. The dependent variable is the variable that you predict, the one you are about to measure. The independent variable is the one you base your prediction on. When you want to predict ice consumption according to the outside temperature, the ice consumption is the dependent variable, and the outside temperature is the independent variable. Start by choosing your dependent variable and ask yourself this question. What factors might predict your independent variable? For ice consumption, this could be the temperature, the age of the consumer, or how much money someone can spend. For choosing your independent variable, use a combination of previous research and your own observations. A good thesis is not only repeating previous research, but also theoretical innovation. Structure thesis. Your thesis should include the following subjects: cover page, abstract, introduction and theoretical framework, method, results, discussion and conclusion, references, appendix. A thesis in the form of a scientific article does not include a table of contents. Cover page. The thesis starts with a cover page, which tells you what the thesis is about and who wrote it. Always consult your faculty about the format of your cover page. Running head. In the upper left, you start with a running head written in capital letters. This is a short version of the title and is a maximum of 5 words. This running head will be placed at the top left of every page. In the upper right, you will be placing your page numbers. Title. Place your title centered on the cover page. A good title is naming the essence of the research, but is not the same as your research question. It must be a catchy title, including your main findings. Furthermore, your cover page should include your name, student number, supervisor, second reader, date, name of the master and university. A picture on your cover page has no additional value. Abstract. The abstract is a summary of your total thesis. The abstract is always written in the past tense and includes the reason for your research, the research question, the method of research, the sample, the main findings, the conclusion. Summary of each topic can consist of 1 or 2 sentences. The purpose of the abstract is to inform the reader in a few seconds about how the research is conducted, why it was conducted, and what the main findings were. You may end the abstract with 3 to 5 key words. Key words give an overview of the central concepts in your research. Introduction and theoretical framework. The introduction does not start with the word introduction. You do start with the title centered above your text. The theoretical framework follows your introduction without the words theoretical framework. It is thus a continuing story with 2 parts, the introduction and theoretical framework. Your introduction should be a clear argument and explains how the concepts of your thesis relate to each other. By making connections between components within the plea, you demonstrate coherence and reflect your thinking process. How do the concepts relate to each other? Make sure your writing in this section is in the future tense. The research is at this point not yet conducted. Ask yourself the following questions. What are we talking about? What do we already know? What don't we know? What are we about to investigate? And what is the added value of your new research? What are we talking about? Which concepts are discussed in your thesis, and how are those concepts defined? Start with explaining your dependent variable. In our example, start with explaining what you mean with ice consumption and why investigating it is worthwhile. What do we already know? In the second part of your introduction, you explain the independent variables. Discuss previous research, including the concepts of your thesis and their common relations. Also explain why this previous literature is of importance for your current research. Are the concepts similar? From which field of study is the research conducted? Which method was used to investigate the concepts? What don't we know? When you have given an overview of what is already known about your research topic, you can then discuss what is not yet known. These holes in the literature are the scientific relevance of your research. Linguistically, this is recognizable from the words however or though, because it is in contradiction of what we already know. What are we about to investigate? Thus far, you have explained what your research is about, what is already known, and what is not investigated yet. In this part, you formulate your research question and explain the relevance of your research. The scientific and social relevance exists of an explanation why your research is interesting and innovative. Don't give away your hypothesis yet. The total length of your introduction is 1 or 2 pages A4. Theoretical framework. After your introduction, begin discussing the theoretical framework. Using a subtitle, you can indicate with which variable your discussion will begin. Assume experts will read your thesis, so you don't have to give an extensive history of the variables. Every psychologist knows what you mean when you mention the Big Five, IQ, or depression. Always start with your dependent variable. This is your main variable. Following this, you then discuss the first independent variable, followed by your first hypothesis. Next are the other independent variables. Close with a conceptual model of all the relationships. While explaining your dependent and independent variables, discuss the following. Definition. Give a definition of your variable, preferably supported by a renowned author. When citing your definition, use the original language and use quotation marks. Correlations. For example, job satisfaction is related to life satisfaction and stress. Consequence. Where does it lead? For example, not being satisfied with your work leads to absence, turnover, or low performance. Antecedents. Which variables predict your current variable? When discussing job satisfaction, look for literature that discusses what makes employees dissatisfied with their job. For example, job characteristics, job demands, or leadership. After discussing the dependent variable, you will then continue with the independent variables. Describe the same 4 points. However, end with the consequences instead of the antecedents, so your discussion ends with the relationship to the dependent variable. Beware, this structure is only guidance. Consult your professor about the exact content of your theoretical framework. Hypothesis and conceptual model. It is preferable to place your hypothesis directly after the substantiation of each variable. A hypothesis is formulated as an expected relation. You have to name clearly the direction of the relationship, positive or negative, and how the concepts relate to each other. Those expected relationships are based on previous literature. After your final hypothesis, give a conceptual model of all variables. This conceptual model will give you an overview of how the concepts relate to each other. When the research is about ice consumption, the conceptual model will look like this. In the appendix, you can see how the theoretical framework has to eventually look. Moderation. The question with moderation is, what is the influence of the independent variable z on the relationship between x and y? We can speak of a moderation or interaction effect when the relationship between x and y gets stronger in the presence of the moderator z. The moderator z and the other independent variable x reinforce each other in explaining the dependent variable y. Example: alcohol has a negative influence on driving behavior. However, when someone uses antibiotics when drinking alcohol, this effect is much stronger. Beware, the effects are not summed up, but alcohol and antibiotics together reinforce each other in driving behavior. In this situation, 1 + 1 = 3. It is the same when you have two crying babies together in one room, when normally the first baby would cry for 10 minutes and the second baby would cry for 5 minutes. Together, those babies might be crying not for 15 minutes, but for half an hour. This is because they make each other cry. They reinforce each other in crying. The reinforcing factor, the second crying baby, is called the moderator. The question with mediation is, why does the independent variable x influence the dependent variable y? With mediation, there is an indirect effect of x via mediator z on y. X leads to z, and z leads to y. The effect between x and y disappears partly or fully in the presence of the mediator z. Example: it is known that people with a high IQ perform better. The reason is that people with a high IQ gather knowledge more easily, allowing them to perform better. However, without knowledge, this relationship between IQ and performance does not exist. Someone with a high IQ will be better in analyzing a neurological abnormality, but this will not be the case when that person doesn't have any knowledge of neurology. In this case, knowledge is the mediator. IQ leads to knowledge, and knowledge leads to performance. Method. In the method, you explain how the research is performed. This must be in such detail that the reader could conduct the research again. The method should be written in the past tense, as this process has already been executed. This description consists of the research design, the participants, the materials, the procedure. Research design. In the research design, you describe which variables are accounted for in the research and what you expect the relationships between the variables to be. Make a clear distinction between the dependent and independent variables. Participants. In this paragraph, you explain how the sample is comprised. What are the characteristics of the people that participated in the research? The width of your sample is of great importance. Too wide a sample is a waste of time, and too small a sample limits the power of your results. It is important to name the following characteristics of your sample. The size. What kind of people participated? Students or children? From which area were the participants from? University or international? How were the participants recruited? Websites or universities? How old were the participants? Mean, standard deviation, and range. What was the distribution of men and women within the sample and within the conditions? Are there any participants removed from the data, and why? Don't forget to describe the boundary conditions, whether or not selecting people for your sample. Materials. In this paragraph, you illustrate the operationalization of the concepts. Ask yourself the question, how do you measure the used concepts? When using a questionnaire, give an example question used to measure the concept. Make sure this is a representable central question. Also give the reliability and validity of the scale you have used. Further explain how you dealt with those scales. For example, reordering or translation of the questions. Also, don't forget to name the source of the questionnaire. Did you create the questionnaire yourself, partly or completely? Give all the items in the appendix. Procedure. In this paragraph, you explain step by step how you conducted the research. With experimental research, this description will be more extensive and detailed than survey research. Make sure you use enough detail that someone else can redo the research. Ask yourself the following questions. Where is the research conducted? Was there a time limit? Did the participants receive any instruction? Always consult the Thesis manual for other criteria. Analysis. In the analysis, you explain which tests you will use to test your results. Explain how you are going to analyze your gathered data. Use those analyses which are relevant and necessary to test your hypothesis. Also introduce your optional background variables, which you will use in the analysis. For example, age, gender, race, etc. Results. Start the results section with the correlation matrix and discuss if there are any exceptions in the matrix. Think of examples like, are all young participants female and all older participants male? Are there any strange values? Is the standard deviation for certain variables extremely high? Those things may be relevant for your discussion. Good results sections give adequate answers to your research question. To give a clear overview of your results, use the following steps per hypothesis. 1. Repeat your hypothesis. Repeat the hypothesis formulated in the theoretical framework. 2. Illustrate your analysis. Name the analysis you have used to test this hypothesis. It is also important to report the significance level used to test the hypothesis. 3. Name statistical findings. Write down the results of the analysis. Also report the non-significant results, as those may be important for your discussion. 4. Briefly illustrate the accompanying conclusion. Beware that you only give a short interpretation of the results, and don't place the results in a wider context just yet. This should be done in the discussion. Tables. When you have complex relationships, it can be useful to report results in a table. With simpler results like men and women, this is often unnecessary. Beware that when you do use a table, you don't literally name the results of the table in your text. APA has several rules for tables. Tables should be placed at the last pages of your thesis, after the literature and appendix, or should be placed within the text. Every table needs to have a number and a title in italics. Each word of the title starts with a capital letter except for words like in, with, of, and. Every table only uses horizontal lines to separate information. Do not use any vertical lines. All tables should be mentioned in the text. Also, see the checklist in the appendix. Discussion. In a scientific article, the discussion and conclusion form one section. In the discussion, you reflect your way of doing research. Ask yourself, what can we learn from this research? A discussion consists of the following parts. Interpret results based on literature, theoretical and practical limitations, suggestions for future research, conclusions and answering the research question. Interpret results. Interpret the relationships you find and refer to the literature cited in your introduction. Also mention the results, which were in contradiction with your hypothesis. Is there an explanation for these results? Try to find an alternative explanation based on literature. Also look at the wider context of your results. What are the possible implications to other disciplines? Limitations. What aspects of your research could be improved? Usually the sample is restricted, which makes generalization difficult, but there may also be other explanations of why your results were different than you expected. Suggestions for future research. Based on the limitations of your research, you can explain what kind of future research is necessary to improve or expand on your research. Also, when expected relationships were found in your research, this can be an occasion for future research to take a deeper look into your topic. Conclusion. End the discussion with a brief summary of your results. Also name the value and relevance of these results. Make sure you answer the research question formulated in the introduction. Literature. APA has several rules for referencing literature. In the text, you refer to literature by naming the authors and the date of publication. This can be done in two different ways. Previous research on job satisfaction, van der Linden 2009, found that van der Linden 2009 concluded that job satisfaction. When the same author is mentioned several times in the same paragraph, you don't have to mention the date of publication again. This is only the case when the author's name is not mentioned within parentheses. All literature you have used in your thesis is cited in the reference list in the end of your thesis. These references must meet APA requirements. When you refer to an article, you must mention the last name of the first author, followed by a comma and the initials with a dot. When there are several authors, you place a comma between the names and add an ampersand sign before the last author's name. The date of publication with parentheses followed by a dot. The title of the article followed by a dot. The journal where the article is published in. The publication source has to be in italics as well as the volume number. Next is the edition number within parentheses. The page numbers of the article in the journal followed by a dot. And potentially the online link to the article, the DOI number. The source of publication is always in italics. Thus, when the reference concerns a book, the title of the book is in italics. When you refer to a book, you have to mention the following. Last name of the author followed by a comma and initials with a dot. Date of publication with parentheses followed by a dot. The title of the book in italics, followed by a colon. When this is outside the US, you write down the city and country, and the name of the publisher followed by a dot. A tip with writing the references is to look for the article in Google Scholar. If you click on the button called Quote, you will get the reference in APA style. Beware, there are a lot of APA errors within these quotes, but it will save you a lot of time. Ending. Next to discussing all parts mentioned in this video, you should also show that you have a scientific level of thinking. Keep asking yourself the question, why things are a certain way and why do you expect certain relationships? Show that you understand what you are writing about and stay critical.